Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I hope you're going to enjoy it. My name is Gene Holtzman. I'm the CEO of Mitchell Martin, Inc. We are a national technology staffing firm. In addition to that, we've developed very strong niches in areas such as cyber, cloud, and DevOps, areas also including RPA and risk and compliance, where we've actually built great talent pools, trying to find the best candidates out there to offer to our clients, either on a full-time or contract basis. A couple of quick announcements. If you have any questions, and we encourage questions, please type them into the Q&A window, and we'll answer as many as we can, either during or after the presentation. Also, we're recording today's session, and we'll send it out to everyone so you can either use it or share it with some of your associates. We have three panelists today who volunteered to share information, and we really appreciate it. One is Cheryl Flannery, Senior Director of Cloud Security, IoT, and Infrastructure Architecture Practice at Pfizer. Cheryl has over 15 years of information security and risk experience in pharmaceuticals, healthcare, consumer products, and manufacturing, and holds the CISSP and PMP certifications. Second, we have Bill Thornton. Bill is the Vice President of Information Risk Technology at Discover Financial Services. Bill is responsible for business continuity and crisis management for DFS, and is a retired United States Air Force, 31 years, and ended as a brigadier general and test pilot. So thanks again, Bill, for joining. Finally, we have David Schweb. David is the CIO of RTI Cable. David is an accomplished cybersecurity and information technology executive and entrepreneur with broad-based expertise leading organizational IT strategy, high visibility projects and programs, and skilled technical teams with experience gained supporting and growing businesses in a Fortune 200 environment. Our session will be moderated by Paul Casal. He's Mitchell Martin, Senior Vice President of Recruiting. Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gene, and thank you to all the panelists for helping us out today, and thank you to everyone that's joined thus far. We think we have a great discussion and a great topic, and as Gene said, any questions that you have, please send them into the Q&A. I will do my best to get them asked and answered during the discussion, but if we don't, we can always do it after. So thank you for that. We like to start off our webinars to start with a polling question. What this does is it gives our panelists a gauge of the level of expertise that the audience has in this area. So I would like to ask all of you quickly, and we're gonna leave everyone a minute or two to just answer the question. Can you describe your level of experience with third-party risk programs? Is it high? We have a robust process in place. Is it medium? We are working on improving our process. Or is it low? We are just getting started. So again, gonna give everyone a minute or two to just answer that, and we'll tally the results on the screen. So please answer that. Thanks. Okay, it looks like we have about 61 of the 89 people answered, so we'll give it another 45 seconds and we'll get started. Okay, perfect. I think we can get started. So first question today. What are the best ways to assess third-party risk?
Hey, I'll take that, Paul, to get started. So, first, just reflecting on the poll that some people had here, about just getting started or is kind of low. Third-party risk is unique. It's ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous throughout industry and probably ubiquitous throughout your company as well. And in a lot of places, it's not well understood, and there's a couple reasons. It's hard. There's not much we can do about it anyway. Or hey, we have SLAs and we have contract language, and so it's up to them to manage their risk, and we don't need to worry about it. Well, if you're in the financial services sector, or it's a really critical part of your company's processes and your revenue and your operations, it is something that you know you need to worry about. Obviously, you're on this call, so it is something you're worried about. I'm thinking about how you communicating, you know, and that concern throughout the company and certainly to some of the leadership. So, you know, I think the first thing about, you know, sort of what the best practices is and how to approach this is, you know, and how to assess the risk is really about assessing the criticality of the vendor to your operations. You know, what and why is that service important to you? And you know, what does that look like if they were to have an outage, or you know, or if they're holding data of yours, you know, what would be the impact if that data were lost? So you have to ask some basic questions. You have to, as you're onboarding a vendor, that's, you know, certain the best time to really understand the risk. So we're going to talk about timing and when to do it here probably later, but certainly understanding the dependency that you have on there, and what are the replacement opportunities to offboard and onboard a vendor if there's a vendor outage or a vendor failure. And we're going to talk about InfoSec, don't worry, but these are actually substantive questions that are part of any third-party risk management, you know, onboarding process and continual evaluation. So if it's going to take you a long time to onboard someone, if this vendor goes bankrupt, goes down, gets bought out, exits the business, or has some sort of catastrophic failure, that's really going to matter. And you may want to have someone on contingency. So asking yourselves those questions before you even get into the InfoSec and security evaluations is really critical. And now there's other things you're going to do, and I just want to get them out of the way in terms of procurement and legal are going to do an evaluation of the corporation. Is it legal? How long have they been in business? What's their market size? You know, what's their commitment to staying in there? That's all things that have to be part of your overall third-party risk management. Now, I have a sense, and I could be wrong here, but most people join because they're in the information security area or interested in that part of third-party risk. And, you know, you have to ask yourself some basic questions when you bring them on board in order to do a sort of more of an in-depth questionnaire. So you've kind of stratified how important they are to the company. You understand their criticality or non-criticality to your process, what that looks like. You know, how are they going to connect to you? Is it just an email connect because it's they're providing a, you know, personnel service and they're just augmenting your team? Or are they providing deep, rich data and they have a direct connection? Are they VPNing in? You know, how are they connecting to you? And what data are we exporting as well? Where is that company data stored? Understanding their dependency on the cloud or where their data is stored, i.e. where your data is going to be stored, is critical. And then, you know, what does their cloud security look like? So you kind of put all that together, you come up with an inherent risk assessment. And now you really get into, you know, and I realize we're in a very short period of time, but now you get into sort of, you know, what does risk mitigation look like? You know, let's get into the information security assessment. And you can look at other documents like a SIG Lite or a SIG Core, a SOC 2 Type 2, which has controls and testing over a period of 6 to 12 months. Very important, but you're going to have your own detailed questionnaire, and you should tailor that questionnaire on their criticality. So if it's like one of your top tier, you know, critical vendors, you're probably even going to do an on-site visit. But you're going to develop this questionnaire. We have a questionnaire. It's 191 questions, fairly detailed before we bring someone on. That's for, and they're conditional, right? So if it's a tier 1 critical vendor, they're going to answer all 191. If it's not, if it's somebody I'm just bringing on, or it's a SaaS service, obviously significantly less. You know, in this day of COVID, it's going to be lots of Teams meetings or Zoom or WebEx or whatever, you know, and you could, even if you would normally do, and we have done this, if you're going to do a data center visit, you could ask them to walk you through the data center so you can understand physical security as well, which absolutely is part of InfoSec. Let me just stop there and just say, look, you're asking their criticality, asking about the company for the risk, and then getting into the InfoSec inherent risk assessment, and then sort of how you might do that do a full up InfoSec thing and just, pass it back to you, Paul.
That's great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Does anyone else, Cheryl or David, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, maybe the other thing to add, very similar to what Bill said, is a way you can approach it is really to think of maybe a 4-tiered process based on risk, just as Bill said. And so the simplest, maybe lowest risk, tier 1, would be foundational. Include contract terms and some of those external requirements, certifications, as Bill mentioned. Second tier, which would be maybe more medium risk, you could do things like leverage security rating services. So these are suppliers that actually do a lightweight, fast, and relatively inexpensive assessment. What they do is scour your external internet presence and determine what really do you have vulnerabilities from that perspective. Have you had compromises, things disclosed? And, it's not perfect, but it's a quick and easy way. Kind of the analogy of that is if you're buying a house, you might go do a drive by the house first to just do a quick look at it and then determine if you want to do more. So that's what I view as tier 2. Tier 3 would be, as Bill mentioned, the questionnaire, which gets a lot more in depth. And, many companies do have their own questionnaire. There are SaaS providers that provide actually an online offering with questionnaires, and even get more robust in, you can do rankings and ratings and light questionnaires, heavy questionnaires. So that's something to consider. And then fourth, similar to what Bill said, is that audit and inspection, which would be much deeper.
Okay. Thank you, Cheryl. I do actually have a question from the audience. How have the new rule changes brought on by the CMMC been treated and adopted in the industry so far? Same goes for NIST 800-172 guidance. Anyone want to jump in and answer that quickly?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I don't think I don't think it's really changed anything for enterprises that have an established, mature third-party risk program. I think what these regulations are doing now is it's taking what's already been that financial services companies and hospitals and other regulated industries have been doing for years, and really pushing the requirements down into other verticals as well. So I don't think it's necessarily changing the scope of what's being reviewed, but I think it's pushing the requirements down to other entities that may not have been in the purview of these third-party risk assessments before. If you're working with 2 unregulated entities, most organizations, unfortunately, don't necessarily choose to adopt these programs. It's more of a regulation is pushing them to adopt these types of programs. So I think as more regulations like these are pushed out, you're going to see more and more companies that were not required to do these sort of reviews are now going to be doing them.
Great, thank you, David.
Yep.
Okay, let's go to the next question. When should you assess the security of third parties and their solutions?
Yeah, Paul, I can jump in on that
Thanks.
one. And I think a foundational item is that it's not a one size fits all. And similar to what we mentioned before, is the when really should be determined by your organization's determination of risk. And not everything, as I said, is created equal. Ideally, you really should start upfront in the contracting process before the contract is signed, because you do have leverage. So if you do the assessment, you uncover issues, you want it to be before you sign that contract so that you can either require remediation to be done, maybe you can build in more terms and conditions, or you can set a plan for remediation. So I think it's really important to do it early up front. And similar to what was mentioned before, is based on that risk, again, not everything created equal, is think about what would happen if that supplier were compromised. If their services were not available, what would that do for you in your business? If they store sensitive information, what would happen? And again, think about tiering of your suppliers. Not all suppliers are created equal. So the when should really be commensurate with the risk. So again, ideally upfront, and then that risk level could also dictate how frequently you may go back and assess. If you go maybe every 2 years, every 3 years, with some of these online tools like the security rating services, you also can set up monitoring. So if you have high risk vendors, you can have some triggers established that if they would have a breach, as an example, that you would be notified, and that could kick in your internal processes. So just a few thoughts about the when.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. It's an ongoing process. You know, I see a lot of newer organizations or smaller organizations doing like, one and done, right? They assess the vendor when they're initially doing the onboarding, but they don't continue to follow up with that vendor. One of the things, for example, InfoSec aside, that I'm particularly concerned with is, maybe a change of management, or, there's an acquisition by a PE firm. Those things trigger to me that there's a, potential change in the level of service that's going to be provided, by that third party. So in addition to like the InfoSec, like the security scorecards and the BitSite and all those other rating agencies, one of the things that I like to do from a vendor intelligence standpoint is also just start aggregating general news, right? So you'll get the breaches, you'll also get change of management, you'll get acquisitions, because, if there's, an acquisition or there's a consolidation in a particular vertical, that could lead to concentration risk, right? So if I have, I'll take telecom, for example, if I have two diverse carriers and then the one acquires the other, I now lost my resiliency, my redundancy. And if I'm not bringing that intelligence feed in and acting on it, I may not be aware that there's now a concentration risk that, all my telecom is now funneled through one particular vendor.
Yeah, I would add, we do, 12, 24, and 36-month reviews, depending on the level of criticality, like Cheryl discussed, whatever tier level you're using. That should drive your behavior as far as how often and at what level of detail you interact with those vendors, those third parties. And so we will even do quarterly scoring of the vendor, both in performance, SLA meeting, and then also there's a cybersecurity component to that as well. And I think that's really important. And there was a remark, a question about security rating services, and some people think they're of low value, and I wouldn't disagree with that, other than, they're relatively inexpensive, like BitSite, and what you get is, oh, there's been a change this month, something happened here, or something may have happened, and if it's one of your critical vendors, because you're not watching your vendors 24 hours a day, that's why you have third party, so you don't have to do all of that. You expect them to be able to do it for the most part, but it gives you an indication to at least look at something. So I wouldn't disagree that, day in and day out, they get a lot of things wrong. But if you see a big drop in the score, that would concern me enough that, I'd certainly be reaching out to them and discussing what's going on, or if something had happened that they didn't tell us about. So they're useful, and they're a cheap way to at least do some monitoring around them. And especially if you're resource constrained, that's certainly an option.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that there is a middle ground, right? You don't have to completely overly rely on your vendor to secure your data. There are certain potential add-on features that you can do to, further secure that relationship with that vendor. Two examples that come to mind is, right, Salesforce. Salesforce isn't completing a due diligence questionnaire, no matter how many times you ask them. I don't care how large of a customer you are. So you have to rely on their SOC 2, you have to rely on their ISO standard and all of that. But Salesforce does have, for example, I think it's called Salesforce Shield, where there's an add-on product where your data is now encrypted. So I would also tell, all the attendees, when you're working with certain vendors, I would also ask them if there's any way that you can strengthen their, their existing security posture, through some add-ons. Another one that comes to mind is Box. Box.com is not going to fill out a due diligence questionnaire, but they have something I believe is called KeySafe, where you can, as a customer, you can utilize your own encryption keys in addition to their encryption keys to further protect your data. So it isn't, all or nothing. There is that middle ground of you as an organization are ultimately responsible for your data. So what could you do, that's within your power to minimize or mitigate that risk of working with that provider? There is going to have to be a reliance to some point, but the goal would be to minimize the potential exposure, from a security perspective.
Great, thank you, David. We do have a couple of questions here from the audience on this topic. First one is, how can third-party entities proactively help their partner organizations in terms of security? Any best practices?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. How could you help? By offering your expertise. Again, taking the Salesforce examples, I'm not getting their chief architect on the phone to, BS with me back and forth about Salesforce, but smaller to medium-sized vendors or even, decent-sized vendors, I'll jump on the phone with their back-end engineers and I'll kind of walk through their infrastructure and discuss, not just the features and benefits and not just the SOC 2 reports, which we'll get into later. The SOC 2 reports do provide some level of, I call it more of a CYA than actually providing real substantive value. Again, the SOC 2s can be somewhat manipulated as far as what's in scope of the audit or what's not in scope of the audit. So it's not enough. I see a lot of organizations, not to go on a tangent, get a SOC 2 report, check it off and say, yay, we have a SOC 2 and, put it in a drawer. You actually have to read the report because the organization is determining what controls are tested or not tested. So they can intentionally leave out certain key controls that are being tested. So you have to read the SOC 2 report. But what I'll do with certain vendors is, once I get past the sales and I get past the pre-sales engineers or the solutions engineers, I'll ask to speak to their CISO or I'll ask to speak to their, chief architect, so I can really understand how they're building their product. And someone who's been a CISO or such as myself, or if I work with other organizations, I'll bring in the CISO and we'll just have a brainstorming session with them if there's certain areas of concern, about how their solution is architected. And I have had certain vendors take some of our suggestions and then implement it because they agree whatever they can do to make people like me happier, their other customers will be happier that they've now strengthened their existing solution. So I would say just have brainstorming sessions with your vendors as well about their security posture.
Yeah, maybe just to build off of that, 100% agree with that. You really want it to be a win-win. Obviously, the third party wants their product to be secure. They don't want to have their product and the name in the news. But from our perspective and your perspective is you want to get to yes. The business has a need for this third party solution, right? There's an objective that you have, and us in our roles for security and risk management should find a way to get to yes and do it in a secure way. So same thing as David mentioned, I found suppliers are very open to that and coming to the table with what some options are, right? It's coming with and problem solving with them.
Cheryl, I think that's a great point about working together and problem solving. We have worked with vendors, especially new ones that are brand new products, startups. In my last company, E-Trade, we loved working with startups because they're hungry. They're far more responsive in terms of product and our needs and things like that. So there's some advantages. Disadvantages, like I said, is what's their level of security. And so partnering together and working and also coming up with a plan to address things like, okay, we'll carry that risk for 6 months or 3 months or whatever, understanding the mitigation you currently have and your plan to address this. And you can do that with small and medium companies. The larger ones like Salesforce or something are difficult, but that partnering and willingness to on both sides to bend a little bit is key to getting to yes, I think.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question around this topic that came up. What are some of the key functions your organizations are looking for from your Tprm platforms or service providers? How do you assess the best value of business outcomes from your chosen service versus some of the others? You want to jump in on that or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say it's really looking at not only the technical things, but also the people and process items as well. So, starting with understanding, from a process standpoint, their policies. From a people, do they require certifications of the people? Do they have, annual security awareness training courses that are required? And then obviously, you can follow some of the external, whether it's NIST or ISO on a lot of the technical controls and mirror those.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, and this comes down to maybe just, having experience in the field, it's really more of like that spidey sense when I'm working with a vendor, right? I could fill out the due diligence questionnaire, they can have the SOC 2, but if risk management is not ingrained in the culture of that service provider, then I don't get that comfortable feeling, even if the due diligence questionnaire comes out great, right? So great, my from a CYA perspective, I'm good. Regulators come in, potential customers or clients or investors are looking, and I follow my process. But if that provider is not doing security because it's the right thing to do and they're doing it because they're required to do it, you feel that, because what will end up happening is they'll implement a new process and then that process won't be fortified, or there'll be a change in a piece of technology and then they won't go and strengthen their existing environment. So having those open dialogues and open conversations, you can get a sense pretty quickly if that provider is doing things because it's best practice versus doing it because they have to.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bill. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I interpreted the question maybe a little bit differently, Josh, that sent this, that what do I expect from my platform? What would a good TPRM platform issue? Let me just take that in a different direction, just in terms of fullness of answer. And so what I expect my third-party risk management platform, set up to do is to have an intake process that spits out an inherent risk. And then as far as the entire platform, I expect it to include everything that was discussed and brought on. I expect it to track the monitoring and the risk. I expect it to do, spit out quarterly assessments for different or annual assessments for different peers to the business risk owner of that or the relationship owner of that particular vendor. And I expect, attestations to be inputted. And if it's not, I expect alerting. So I don't know if that was the put of what you're expecting from a platform, but I expect it to do all that for me. And so automated so that, and again, it's all tiered, right? Some of the basic things I just don't care about, the lower tier ones, to Cheryl's point earlier. But the higher one, I want to know, and I want this automated so nothing drops off the table. I want to know what their resiliency looks like. I want that attestation as well. So that's sort of what we're looking for from our platform.
Great, thank you. All right, we're going to get to our next question here regarding the cloud. When your organization is building solutions using cloud providers such as AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, how do you ensure your developers build them securely?
I can jump in and start. I'm sure David and Bill will chime in. So I think, as with anything, you can never ensure everything, but there is a lot that you can do. And I think it does cover all aspects of people, process, and technology. And just to give you a couple tips from each of those, first, from a people perspective, developers should understand security. So it does start with, hiring developers that understand security, but it doesn't end there. As everyone knows, threats continually change and technology continually changes. So ongoing education and awareness is really critical, so your developers understand the risks, what controls they need to implement. And it is different on different technology platforms, even between AWS, Azure, and GCP, it's different. So they need to know how to implement the right security controls in that. So that ongoing education and awareness is critical. You can also create a lab or an experiment area for them to play with and learn. So that's from a people perspective. From a process perspective, two things come to mind here. So the first is make sure that folks, developers, know what's required. What are the required controls or guardrails based on risk, right? It's not a one size fits all. If it's a less risky application, you don't need to have all of the controls, right? But if it's a riskier application, you should have more controls, and they should know what those are. Also, on the flip side, you obviously want the protective things built in, but you want to make sure on the other extreme, if something bad happens, you have the right incident response plans in place. So, do you know who the developers are, right? If there's something that comes to light that, an S3 bucket were compromised, who do you quickly go back to? So it's just as important from a process perspective, if something goes wrong, to have that open dialogue and process with your developers. And then finally, from a technology perspective, 2 items. One would be around establishing that foundational infrastructure or platform as a service for your developers to use. don't let them reinvent it and recreate it every time. Try to build in, that you have your identities integrated in, you have the basic controls, like encryption is always turned on. And then also put tools in the hands of the developers, give them tools that they can security test and scan their code. They can automate things themselves. So number of things from my perspective. Bill or David, anything from you?
Yeah, I'll, unless Bill, you wanted to jump in, I have some thoughts. I have a love-hate relationship with developers, developers, and I understand their mindset. Their mindset is to get something to market quickly. They generally, from experience, I'd say more often than not, are not security minded. They want to do things as quickly as possible to get something into production so they can move on to the next project. And the way that I work with developers is to assume that they're not securing anything, even if there's a process in place. So my thought with developers is really, it's like defense in depth, right? So you have multiple layers of technology to ensure that they are doing things securely, and also rolling up your sleeves and having the security department sit down with them with the architecture. Unfortunately, I've been in organizations where security is not involved in a lot of projects, and we'll have to re-architect the entire thing because the developers, just as a quick example, I've seen them use, API tokens and secrets and just store them in clear text in GitHub, that's open to the world. Because for them, it's just easier than having to develop a vault and having, setting up VPCs in AWS and, cutting off communication and having to grab API keys out. And, it's not in their nature to build those types of things unless they have gone through security training. So part of it is sitting with them at the drawing board when you're architecting this thing, so to ensure that it's architected correctly, but then also implementing security controls, assuming that they're not going to be doing the right thing, unfortunately. So there's certain tools, and there's a lot of emerging tech right now that's coming out for cloud security. Some of the better ones that I've been introduced to, one of them is called Orca Security or Lightspin. They're doing some really amazing things in the cloud by enumerating all of your different resources in the cloud environment and correlating permissioning back and forth from the different resources. So that way you could see, that this particular IAM policy was not configured properly, 7 layers deep is now going to affect this S3 bucket or this Lambda function. And without these types of tools, you don't really know that, the developer who's doing this IAM policy, what the potential ramification is, 6 or 7 connected resources down. So I think it's a matter of just assuming that they're not going to be doing the right thing, unfortunately, and developing controls in place to, either detect and also prevent them from doing things that they shouldn't be doing.
Well, David, Bill, I couldn't agree more strongly with that. And it's unfortunate. We would love to see them have the training and build in secure coding practices from the beginning. We just don't see that. So I think, our job is to be the naysayer and the doubter and surround security around that, and also do the static and dynamic testing of code when we can, or insist that it's done, or look into that if we're getting third party. But nothing else to add to that.
Thank you. We do have a question related to this topic from the audience. At times, it feels the questionnaires we use are too legacy, not fully adapted to current reality clouds and the plethora of services that introduce risk. What is your approach to assess these new services and provide reasonable assurance controls are in place?
I agree, right? The due diligence questionnaires are developed by, think tanks. The SIG2 is probably, 10, 15 years old at this point, and it's been adopted over time. But I think many organizations are now adding and putting their own questions on there. So I would say most organizations, use the SIG as a template, but then add your own questions, because, no one knows better than you what the environment that you're trying to protect on. So, use the standard questionnaires and then add on your own. But then go in depth, right? The questionnaires are usually, do you have a security policy? Yes or no. Well, what does that tell me? The security policy could be so porous that there's no point in having a policy or process in general. I would say ask in depth the questions that you're really trying to ask. Don't ask yes or no questions. Ask them to explain in a narrative. How are you protecting your API keys? How are you ensuring that the data transmitted is encrypted? Is it enough to say is it encrypted? What encryption algorithm are you using? So I would say just get a lot more granular in the questions that you're asking your vendors. And to go back to Cheryl's point earlier, the time to do that is when you're negotiating. That's when you have the leverage. So you put in the contract, they have to answer these questions and they have to provide evidence to substantiate some of their answers, because that's the problem as well too. from a CYA, if I get a questionnaire back that says they're doing something that's great, I can point back to it if there's ever litigation and say, you told me you did this, but it doesn't help me if they lied. So I would also put in the contract that they have to provide evidence to actually demonstrate that they are in fact encrypting. Show me the encryption algorithm, or tell me the encryption algorithm, or allow those phone calls where we can actually dive into the tech, because you can tell really quickly from speaking to them, whether or not they're doing certain things.
Great, thank you. Bill, did you want to add something?
No, I was going to ask you to repeat the question because you had an interruption in the stream or something. I apologize,
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
but I'm sure it's been
Question
answered.
was basically how questionnaires, that we use are too legacy, not fully adapted to current reality clouds, and the plethora of services that introduce risk. And what is your approach to assess those new services and provide reasonable assurance controls are in place?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I would just I would echo Dave's comments and just suggest that refresh of the questions that you're asking and the controls really have to be done by SMEs and have to be done on a more frequent than annual basis. And we should constantly be bringing up and challenging the teams to come up with the questions on specific areas. You could either just read, about cloud security, cloud misconfiguration, and say, how are we going to ensure ourselves that's not going to happen? Ransomware is the go-to attack this year, right? What are we doing about, what kind of questions can we ask to ensure that we feel they've got a handle on either, ransomware itself or strong escalation, so we're notified, so we can make disconnect decisions, at the speed of light, speed of business, to ensure that we don't get infected. All those questions, really have to be refreshed with subject matter experts, but they have to be challenged because a lot of times they're just looking at the same old list and are not really stopping their everyday work to think about it. So I have to say, even when it's a new area, you have to guard against complacency in terms of your review process for those questions.
Great, thank you.
And by the way, you really need to assess your workforce and the skills level. I know that's a topic here. If you don't have the right people in the room and you don't have the right people on the job, you need to find a way to, do a talent uplift through training, through additional resources, or outside help. Even if it's just episodic, we're gonna have a third party come in and help us review this every 6 months. It's worth the money.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question we have is about small and medium-sized companies. How can organizations with limited budgets protect themselves?
I'll take this one. The answer is you take a risk-based approach, right? So you look at, what are you trying to protect yourself against? The first thing that I usually advise organizations is, what types of threat actors are you most concerned with? The examples that I usually give when I'm giving a presentation is, somebody like Planned Parenthood is most likely going to be concerned with more like a hacktivist, somebody who's against their mission and their objective. And then you take a step back and you say, okay, as a threat actor, how would I be trying to effectuate a business disruption? So it might be something like flooding their phone line so they can't, call clients, or maybe, disrupting the website. They're not necessarily after intellectual property. They're not trying to infiltrate the network and trying to, do a data breach. Possibly maybe to get some patient infos, to damage the reputation, but most likely it's going to be a hacktivist, and most likely it's going to be some sort of business disruption. So the small to medium-sized companies need to first do that exercise to determine who are we trying to protect ourselves against. And then from there, they need to look at, what types of controls do we need to put in place in order to protect those? And that's like, what you should do first. And then from a budgetary perspective, obviously address the other risks, or the probability of those risks are going to be maybe medium and low, but you should obviously address them. But I would start off by looking at, again, who am I trying to protect myself against, and what is their ultimate goal? Are they trying to disrupt business, trying to steal intellectual property, or are they, just ransomware and they're trying to, get some money out of an organization?
Great, thank you, David. And just one more question here related to that. Should an organization control their own security as opposed to relying on a provider? And can I do it better myself?
Honestly, I think it depends on the organization. You know, if you're a Citigroup, yes, you know, in many instances, you're going to do it better than your service provider. But if I'm a company with, you know, even hundreds of people, I'm not going to have the security team that AWS has, that Amazon has. So in some respect, there needs to be this comfortableness with delegating somewhat responsibility about the protection of your data to your third-party provider. However, you need to keep oversight of them. So even if it's AWS, I've seen organizations say, well, it's an AWS, so I'm good. That's not the case, right? There's configuration options within AWS. You can have, you know, direct connect. You can have, you know, VPN tunnels in, so it's not open to the public. You know, encrypt your data from a file level perspective, or maybe you want to encrypt it at the database level. So it's not enough to say, well, I'm using AWS, so therefore it's secure. So there is some responsibility that's still retained with the underlying, you know, client who's engaging with a third party. And in some cases, yes, you may be able to do it better yourself. If there's something that is critical to your organization, as there was a breach of this data and it would have such a negative impact to your organization that you couldn't withstand, you know, we call it the New York Times test, being on the front page of the New York Times. You know, Target obviously can withstand, from a monetary perspective, having bad press for a month or two after the hack. They'll know that, you know, there's going to be, you know, negative press on them, and maybe they're going to lose some customers, but, you know, people have short-term memories, and then they're going to go back and start shop there. But if it's a smaller company and they lose the faith of their clients, or say it's a law firm of, you know, 10 partners, and there's a big data breach and one of their clients' data is now, you know, out in the public, all of their clients may now start switching law firms and may go out of business. So I would say for organizations like that, if there's such a criticality of it, it may be better for you to invest the time and money to hire staff and to, you know, protect that data as opposed to relying on a third party.
Yeah, I would add to that from a third party perspective, if you're worried about third party risk and they're in the cloud, to the point made, I would not say that you should feel secure about that. You would really want to look at their expertise and how they're managing their cloud security. AWS is as porous or secure as you want to be. A lot of advantages to cloud, or security is not one of them. It can be, but it's not inherently one, like scalability, flexibility, agility, all that stuff. If you're asking about just, you know, like from your company, should you use an MSSP, you know, a security service provider? You know, if you can't afford to do the security right, then yes. But you really should understand what you're getting and what that MSSP is doing. Yeah, generally you can do security better yourself if your leadership and your company is committed to doing it, and there's enough money to put into it. And if you do go to an MSSP, or you're going to outsource part of your security, you just need to fully understand exactly what they're going to be doing for you. A lot of times when people find out what MSSPs are actually doing for them as they mature, they're surprised how little it was versus their expectations. So you have to be an informed buyer of that service as well, is what I would say.
Great.
You know, and I think another point to bring up here is you know, the concern over, you know, what's called shadow IT. That can introduce a tremendous amount of third-party risk into an organization. And, you know, a quick example, if people aren't familiar with that term, you know, say you're an organization that uses Salesforce, right? Salesforce, let's just assume for the sake of this conversation that they're doing everything they need to from a security perspective. So you're safe with Salesforce. But then you have a business unit that's, and I've had this happen to me, a business unit that's going to a conference. And they go and they download this cool app where they can scan business cards, and then it gets ingested into Salesforce. And now they have all these wonderful leads and contacts. And then you find out, well, how is that information getting ingested into Salesforce? And the business person will show me, oh, well, I just type in my Salesforce username and my Salesforce password, and it uses my credentials to scan. Well, I'm like, well, now you just gave your credentials over to this third-party business scanning app, where I, as the CISO or CIO or CTO, this didn't go through the normal procurement process. This was somebody who used his credit card, went out online, bought this application. And in many instances, because it's Salesforce and it's not our own technology, you don't really have the ability to, you know, be made aware that these types of connections are happening. So I think like shadow IT is also something that many organizations need to figure out a way to integrate into their third-party the risk program.
Great, thank you. Next question. How can subject matter experts address their own skills gap and or lack of resources?
I'll jump in on this one also. I think the first thing is being self-aware, right? Nobody's an expert in every particular area. And being upfront and honest that there's a particular area that you may not be an expert in, I think is key. I see a lot of people that, will fail to, just admit that maybe, they don't know what a Lambda function is, or they don't know how AWS IAM policies work, or they don't know networking, or they don't know, security on the networking side, or, the differences between the different encryption algorithms. It's okay. No one's an expert in every different area. So I think understanding where your gaps are and addressing them either through consultants or, leveraging your service provider in that area, or, going through training, right? There's a million of these like little micro credentials that people can go for. Like, I love like Linux Academy and Cloud Guru. They have, the ability to go on and just stand up, these labs and, get certificates in, very specific areas that I'm particularly interested in. So I would say be aware, and then also start looking at these micro credentials, whether it's, Cloud Guru or Udemy or Coursera. There's a lot of these great courses where you could just go on and just, learn this specific piece of technology.
Yeah, I think that's right. First, be true to yourself and acknowledge, where you're shortcoming. As a manager, I have used Udemy and some other tools to do assessments of my team, and again, not in a way that is meant to insult people, but to see where the weak parts are in my team as well, and then get training. So I took over this team last year, and they had spent about $80,000 on training, and in helping them understand, I think, where their shortcomings were. This year, the training requests for $350,000, and that includes, the licenses we have for Udemy and some of the other ones, and some of the courses we have. We have a technical training academy as well at Discover, and so I think that's important. I also think there's it's a lifelong learning, and you have to get people excited. And again, a little bit off the question of, what to do, but get them excited about their profession. And they should be also just seeking out their own personal growth through just staying up on articles, just like doctors and lawyers do, on the latest thinking and latest trends, and some understanding. And that will help them understand where they are missing and where there are some gaps. And the final thing I always try to do is talk about training versus education. And training is very specific. Education is a lot more background. It's a lot harder, and it's a lot more critical thinking. But when you can get education in a certain area versus training, you'll quickly find that you'll be an expert in the area, because it's teaching you how to learn, how to think critically about it, as opposed to just some point pieces of knowledge. And for a lot of people, that's all they need, because they already have that educational background. I don't know about you, but I'm finding a lot of people, with very advanced experience, but not as many education degrees as I think we used to see in the past. That's just a trend, and it just is what it is.
Great, thank you, Bill. Final question of the discussion, and hopefully we have a couple of minutes for some quick Q&A, but this is going very well. We all know that last year, everything changed, obviously. What did you do during COVID to ensure third-party risk assessments were still valid?
Yeah, I'll kick that one off if that's all right. So my position was in the second line of defense. So it was third-party information security, risk management, as well as oversight of the CISO and the other areas. So what we did is we looked at our top vendors, and we sent out a questionnaire, a survey for them to fill out. And we sent it out in 3 waves, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it's like, can you still perform your work? We found a couple places that weren't able to do that. And that was very important, that we onboarded someone else, or we had someone on a retainer. And we send out paper statements, and we do that at our own facility. And we had another one that we were paying a lot of money for retaining to be able to do that. They came back and said, "No, we can't do that." And if we had had a COVID outbreak in our area and had to shut down, we were in violation of all kinds of laws about sending out credit statements, right? For Discover, things like that. So that was a very important question. You know, what are your impacts? Are your people working remotely? A lot of places did not initially go to that. Are they using company issued equipment? You know, what's their access to our data remotely? What are your policies for control of data in the remote work environment? Did you have them, or have you always had them? You know, could we take a look at them? And as I said, we sent them out to our vendors. So we have those tiers, and we send them out to like our top 30 or 40 vendors that they're doing critical process for us that, you know, we can't afford to be down. Settlement, you know, computing interest rates, whatever you want to think of. And then also ones that are holding our critical or PII data. And then we did that in 3 waves. And we ended up, you know, everyone, I think a lot of the companies, even if you're mid-size, have probably over 1,000 vendors. Probably many have many more like we do. And so you can't do them all. It would have been an end-to-end, you know, 3,000 factorial, everybody reaching out to everyone. So we tiered it, and we ended up sending surveys to about 150. And we got approximately, you know, 140 replies. Some of the big ones, you know, just said, look, we're dealing with it like everyone else. They didn't reply, and, you know, you're stuck with their answer because, you know, it might be a Salesforce or someone, just too many, can't reply to everybody, but, you know, trust us. And of course we had to, but we did get about 140 replies. And based on those replies, we went back and said, well, you know, we'd like to have our InfoSec team follow up with you on a couple of your answers. And also one of the things that we did for ourselves is we brought in a third party to do a quick check of our risk assessment and our policies from a work from home remote work environment, make sure that they made sense for a larger group.
Yeah, I guess maybe just one other quick thing to add that maybe came to light with COVID is you have suppliers, maybe if you think of your broader ecosystem, that you may not have thought of that you needed to assess. So maybe they're not a SaaS provider or a technology provider, but it's somebody that you're getting raw materials from. And, you know, as we all saw, supply chains were taxed, and that could impact your business greatly. So I think one of the things that came to light as well is take a step back, work with procurement to say, who are our critical suppliers that if something happened to that supply chain, we need to understand that and potentially what mitigation. So, you know, you can stretch your third party assessment program maybe beyond who your traditional people would be that you would assess to others that are critical to your supply chain. And I think, you know, that certainly has been some of the impacts in COVID to make sure you're looking out for those things.
Great, thank you, Cheryl. So that actually concludes our questions for the discussion, but I think we do have about 4 or 5 minutes left where we could take a couple of questions from the audience. There are a bunch in here, so forgive me if I cannot get to everyone. I want to be respectful of everyone's time to end on time, but here was a question from earlier I couldn't get to. What part does change control management play in third-party vendor management?
So I can take a stab at that here. Let me make a couple assumptions for this. So I'm going to assume that it is either a licensed piece of software or something that's on your system, or you're making changes that will impact them. And in that case, it's absolutely critical. Has to be part of the SDLC process, has to be part of the change management process, and having that identified, you know, what those vendor dependencies are on any changes that you're making, and it has to be part of your test environment, or you have to at least test it separately. A lot of people won't let you put their software in your test environment without additional license, which frankly you should push back on. There's no sense in paying that. They know that it's just for testing, and it makes things work better. But I would say that if you don't include your vendor in your change management process and testing, you probably back out a lot of changes and have a lot of failures.
Thank you, Bill. And I think we have time for one more. What trends in auditor and regulator expectations do you see in representing the effectiveness and maturity of your third-party risk management program?
I'll jump in on this one. I think, I look at regulatory requirements, honestly, as the bare minimum that an organization needs, right? So I look at regulatory requirements and auditors as, not even auditors, but the regulatory requirements as catching up to where the industry should be. And they're always behind, right? So I would never look at a regulation as, okay, this is all I need to do. It is the bare minimum that after, an event happened, the regulatory requirement now comes out that an organization needs to do. So I would never look at that as like, this is the framework that we need to adhere to. It's always the bare minimum. And again, even auditors, right? So auditors are coming in, they don't have knowledge of your particular area. So I don't think that passing an audit or being in regulatory requirements should suffice to good third-party risk management or just risk management in general. It's a very small component of having a mature risk management platform.
I got to jump in, completely agree with that. It's kind of like compliance does not equal security. Same thought process here. The only thing I would say, if you're looking for a trend, expectations are going up though. I'm not, and again, not saying that yields in risk reduction, but we've seen in last year's exams from the regulators and this year, tremendous expectations being levied on us for our knowledge and understanding of third parties, their cloud dependencies, their dependencies, so fourth party dependencies. And, it's going to be a lot of people checking each other out because there's a lot of two-way business, but that expectation's increasing. But to David's point, that does not mean you're actually reducing risk. So just caution to keep those two things in mind.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you all. We are on the dot right now at 1 o'clock. So perfect. That was excellent. I want to thank our panelists, David, Cheryl, and Bill, for their time and their expertise in this area. We think it was a great topic. And we really appreciate all of you, and we appreciate the audience, their participation, their questions. We thought that was excellent. So we are going to be doing a series of these at Mitchell Martin, hopefully with the same panelists. We would love to have them back again on some other topics. If anyone has any suggestions on a topic or feedback, we would greatly, greatly appreciate it. And we will be sending all of the audience members that participated today or joined us today a survey, and we hope to be doing more of these over the coming months. We're actually already in planning sessions on them right now. So again, thank everyone for their time. Thank you so much to the panelists, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks.